So try not to unmute yourself. We will keep tabs on the chat, and there are other AI catalysts with us today. I'll mention what that means shortly. But the other catalysts that are here, other folks, Liza Long, Jason Blomquist, I think are here, and they were both AI fellows last year. Feel free as folks have questions about what's going on, feel free to respond and help each other out. So this is kind of like, part of the purpose of this webinar series from the AI Catalyst is to provide and build kind of a community of practice. I'll drop this link into the chat. And this is not something you have to get started on right now, but what I'm going to encourage you to do is there are two options here. So like we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, we'll talk about, how to scale what you learn and to do things like create projects, gems, GPTs, mini apps, artifacts, that kind of stuff. If you have really cool ideas, some of you, there's a whole range of proficiency with AI adoption here. If you have really cool ideas that you want to share with other faculty, please use this Padlet. You just click on the link and you jump into this Padlet space here. And then you would add, click on this plus thing and then just start typing, right? And then publish, and it'll show up like Kevin Ranks example here. If you have really cool ideas you want to share, um, please put them in that Padlet space. And then we'll share that out afterwards. So you can kind of see like what your peers are doing. If you have questions, you're like, hey, you know what, this is covered in the presentation, or this was not covered, and this is something like I would like to hear more about or get trainings in at some point, go ahead and add, drop that comment here in this section. And then as we're going through the presentation, if anything comes up, if you have questions about a slide, just go ahead and drop that into the chat. So kind of a range of options there, but we'll come back to this webinar Padlet in a little bit. So I mentioned this is an AI Catalyst webinar, and I just want to briefly explain what that is. So this is the first webinar in a series we'll be doing as part of the Idaho AI Catalyst Initiative. And this was funded and organized by Heidi Estrom, who is now our Chief Academic Officer at the Idaho Office of the State Board of Education. And there are 8 catalysts. You can see on the right-hand side here. There are 8 catalysts representing the 8 public higher ed institutions in Idaho, and I am the AI lead for the group. And today I'll be presenting with 2 other catalysts, Kevin Rank and Heidi Teague. And Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself, and then Heidi?
Sure. I've been teaching about generative AI since very early on. I'm on the 5th semester teaching a business class on it for Boise State here at the College of Business and Economics. I am the AI fellow for our college. Uh, I also do teach faculty here at Boise State and tend to be very involved in this field right now.
And I teach writing and creative writing at CEI. And my focus tends to be more on the pedagogical and the linguistic and rhetorical nature of what's happening with LLM. So it's an exciting adventure.
And I'm the current department chair of integrated studies at CWI, and I've created trainings for first year experience courses there. Presented at several different conferences on AI trainings, just how to implement for faculty and staff, and within institutions. And I've worked closely with a lot of you folks here, so it's good to see you. All right, so as I mentioned, this is like the first webinar in a series of webinars we'll be doing, probably 3 in the fall and then 3 in the spring, around there. And we'll do kind of ad hoc ones as well. But we're trying to be very intentional and deliberate with how we create and plan these webinars. And so this one is going to lay what we consider to be a fairly broad and scalable foundation, right? So the first session is going to provide a little bit of technical information on how large language models work, risk and limitations. that kind of stuff, just to be aware of. But the focus, the meat of this will be on like, hey, how do you get started, with just prompting? What does that mean? How do you build robust prompts? And then look at, I mean, the kind of the key thing with this presentation as well is like, how does this work for faculty? And especially like, we want to provide you with things that kind of help you in your job. And so 3 and 4 are going to be a major focus here. And then from there, we're trying to figure out like, okay, so like, what can you do next? How do you scale this? And so we're trying to like address just a range of proficiency levels here, from fairly basic to like highly advanced, and just point to like, hey, by the way, this is where things can go for you, right? And then provide resources and tools and a community that can support you in those efforts. Just briefly here, I want to consider like where we're at with AI adoption. And so this is the most recent data. And another way to think about this webinar series is like you kind of have to like train yourself every year with these tools because things change. And so like, hey, let's relearn some of these basics and consider how to advance, but also like update it for 2025, right? And so this is where things are at with in 2025. This is from the DEC Global AI Faculty Survey. The sample size was around 1,700, representing faculty across the globe. And they found that within this, for those who responded, 61% of higher ed faculty say they've used AI in teaching. And we have actually really recent data from Jason Blomquist and Liza Long, who did a survey as AI fellows last year. And they found I think it was like 400 and some participants in the survey. Of those, 76%, so they had used AI in teaching. The sentiment, like those who are using this, how do they feel about this implementation? Are they excited about it? Is it positive, negative? 57% say it's positive. And then the vast majority say like, hey, they see themselves using AI in the future. And what's interesting is that you start to see regional differences here. The United States view it as an opportunity. Sorry, in the United States, 57% view as an opportunity, whereas American Pacific and then Latin America, we get as high as 78%, which is really interesting to me. And then barriers for adoption, and for me, this is part of like, kind of pointing to the purpose of this presentation, of those who do not use AI in their, in teaching and the workflows. Why don't they do that? 40% said they don't have time or resources to explore. And like I've heard this, many times. Like it kind of sounds important. I know I should care about this. I just don't have the time. I don't have the energy. I don't have the funding, the support, that kind of stuff. So we're trying to provide address many of those concerns. One thing that I really want to emphasize, and those who really get into this can kind of like, you understand what I'm getting at here. But like educators, I think we have a bias towards just like thinking theoretically around about many things. Like, just we got to read the textbook, all this stuff, do tons of research. I mean, that's certainly like my bias when I approach many new topics. Generative AI, like when using things like ChatGPT, is less a set of concepts to learn and understand the theory and more about just like tinkering and experimenting, right? So like we're only really 2.5 years into this technology within higher education. A lot of this is like procedural learning, just like, playing around. Once you know some basics, just playing around and seeing like, oh, this works and this doesn't. Like there's not really like all of us are figuring this out together during this time period. And you're kind of like, you're kind of mapping out the future for yourself when you do this, right? So those who tinker will learn much more than those who just study it. And kind of the struggle here, and there's research that shows this is indeed the case, is that there is a learning curve. And so a lot of different things have a J curve effect where those who initially spend more time or initially like experiment with a new technology or new techniques initially spend more time on daily tasks. But then once a certain threshold of familiarity is reached, and you probably kind of, if you've built, things like, custom chatbots, GPTs, all that stuff, you probably feel this strongly. It takes a while to figure this out. But then when you do this, once you figure it out, it becomes part of your workflow, you're just zooming along and you're kind of freeing yourself up for much higher level kinds of tasks and more interesting things as well, right? And so that's partly what we're trying to address as well, is like, how do we get you through this J curve with as little, as little pain as possible. All right. So these two, we're going to do two sections here. They're going to be slightly technical. It'll be fast. This is not, again, this is like less on theory and more on, it's like, hey, let's do stuff, right? As I get through this, feel free to jump into the chat, like ask questions. Others in the chat will be able to help you out. Kevin and Heidi are here as well to help with that. And then Kevin and Heidi, you can stop me if there's like something that we need to pause and think through a little bit. But some just basic terminology. So let's look at like, we're looking at a ChatGPT interface, right? If I go to chatgpt.com, right, this is what I'm looking at here. I can start typing things in this, where it says ask anything. You'll see like it says ChatGPT 5, and then there's a menu that goes down, GPT 5, and then there's things like, auto instant thinking, right? These are kind of new as of a month ago, about or 3 weeks, I don't know. So what's going on here, right? What do we need to know to be effective? So GPT-5 is going to be an AI model, and this is a concrete or a specific instance of an LLM, a large language model, which itself is a machine or a computer that can create new content based on user prompts, and we're going to call that generative AI, right? So generative AI, you can see, is a specific form of deep learning, which in turn is a form of machine learning, which in turn is sits within this broader category of what we call artificial intelligence, this effort to build machines that think and act like humans. The emphasis on like there, kind of a simile, definitely not the same thing, right? And then thinking model, I do want to throw this definition here and highlight it because it's going to come up again and again. Increasingly, like to be effective at complex tasks, to kind of make these things work within your workflow. It is important to select the right model, and thinking models increasingly are going to be your go-to, especially for like those initial prompts and initial like projects. Making sure you're toggling that option there. You can see that up here, in my pull-down menu. And what this does is it extends an AI models, so like GPT-5, it extends that model's capabilities by using more compute to like quote unquote think through problems step by step. So we used to have to like build these into the prompt, say like, hey, step by step, consider this, or kind of incorporate what's called like chain of thought stuff, chain of thought prompting. Now that's kind of built into the thinking model itself. So there's some basic terms. Others will come up, but those are some basics I want to get through. So this is going to be the most technical slide, but I think it's helpful to know, like, just how these models are actually trained, because it helps you like make sense of like, okay, this is why it's behaving the way it does. And so some kind of basic things here. There are many different ways to like, I guess, chop up how these models are trained. This is just one version. This is not like this sort, not the source of truth. Andrej Karpathy has some amazing YouTube videos. If you look at there's a video on his deeper dive into LLMs. Others do really good work, so I'd encourage you to check this out. But roughly speaking, we have like a few different stages here. And the initial stage is to identify what data you're going to train the model on. And increasingly, this is like proprietary, or they're OpenAI and others have partnerships with platforms like Reddit, academic journals, that kind of stuff. So this is where a lot of money is going right now. It's just forming partnerships with people who actually produce data, and just excellent content. And increasingly, it's multimodal. So like all the major models now are multimodal, meaning that they not only decipher and create text, but also audio and video. And so these companies will identify like, okay, this is the data we're going to train on, which includes text, audio, and video. And this is run through what's called a tokenizer. And these tokenizers are actually pretty fascinating. Basically, tokenizers represent words, parts of words, grammatical markings, that kind of stuff, as discrete numbers. And these numbers are then converted into embeddings. And you can see kind of an image here. Realize it's not, it's a little bit small, but you can kind of see how there's just like different like colors representing parts of the graph, right? And these colors are the embeddings. So these embeddings basically represent tokens as vectors, meaning like showing how they relate to other tokens in a certain field, right? So you can see like, charger, battery, DeWalt, Home Depot would belong over here. They're related vectors, right? Or related tokens. So that's initial. We start to see patterns emerge when we do this, and so the next step is then to feed this through a neural network, and these are the GPTs. They're transformer-based architecture, and these are specialized forms of machines that learn from these patterns, these initial relationships, right? You may have heard things like parameters and weights. So the LLMs, these large language models, LLMs, they process this text, video, audio. They learn patterns and connections between the tokens. This process establishes the weights, and the weights are the parameters that define how the model responds to inputs, right? So this is kind of the magic here. You want to figure out like what are these relationships? The final step is going to be post-training. So this is called pre-training. And then the post-training is models undergoing fine-tuning using human feedback. There's more than one way to do the post-training and fine-tuning, but the most common way right now is still RLHF, which requires human feedback. And this is going to make sure that the models so after the model's been trained, just like, is it useful? Is it accurate? Is it safe? That kind of stuff, right? And then finally, so what happens when you prompt ChatGPT? And I think this is helpful for like figuring out like when things go wrong or why you're not getting that response. Just understanding like it's not you're not interacting. We're not interacting directly with the base model. That never happens, right? So a lot of stuff going on, and the more you understand this, the more you can kind of like strategize. And the most important part of the strategy. So when I jump into ChatGPT, right, like and I start typing something here. Right, you see the screenshots. Like, for example, where should I go for lunch today? This is an example that I get from BSU did an AI summit in last May for faculty and staff there, and they use this example as a way just to kind of become familiar with how these things work. And I thought it was a really good example. It's interesting. Like, I don't like it. It starts the result. Based on the simple prompt is like fairly tailored to me, even though like it says, it has things like low carb protein forward. I'm not like low carb right now. I think at some point, like I was having this exchange with ChatGPT and it just picked up like, oh, this must be a low carber. So I'm not currently low carb. But it's interesting. It's like feeding that into the context, right? And then it's like Boise, like where's it getting this information about me that I live in Boise? Where does that come from? And then you'll notice that it's like searching the internet. So there's a lot of stuff going on here just with the simple prompts, right? So this is what happens. The ChatGPT will assemble context, and this is like the most important stage. There's a system message that sits on top of ChatGPT, right? So I'm not interacting with the base model. There's a message that literally says stuff like, you are a friendly, supportive chatbot who does, and then it specifies like, this is how you should behave. And that's going to determine how it, responds to the concept, the context, the input that I give it, right? In addition, I can control things like tools and settings. Is it just a plain old prompt? Am I doing a deep research report? Am I doing a canvas? Am I doing am I toggling the agent option in ChatGPT? That kind of stuff. And then long chat histories, like if this is part of a chat, then that's going to be fed into the context. It's going to assemble that automatically, even if I don't, even if I'm not aware of that. And then increasingly, like you'll notice, like it knows who I am, it knows where I live, all this stuff. It's picking some of that information out from my profile, but also these systems by default now. So Gemini, ChatGPT, and other systems, they have a memory option that's turned on. And so when you build a project, when you chat for a while, it's retaining like bits of information as embeddings, and it's going to pull that in. It's going to determine like, okay, this prompt seems related to these other prompts. It pulls that in as context. So a lot happens to assemble a context. It's run through a tokenizer, which we mentioned, last time. It's going to translate that into discrete numbers. It's run through the model. This is called inference. And here, the context is going to be is it's turning the context into probabilities for each possible next token. And there's things I'm not going to get like too fancy here, but you can like turn up or down the temperature with in a different, if you go to developer mode or something, you can turn up or down the temperature to choose the top token, the most probable token, or you can actually just have it sample from a probability distribution, and this is called stochastic, right? So you might have heard the term stochastic parrots, like, oh, these this AI is just stochastic parrots. This is kind of what they're referring to. It's a probability distribution. You're getting the token that is just a sampling from that probability distribution, right? The key is like the next probable token, like just keep that in mind. This response is just in terms of probability, right? So we get the tokens; those are sent through the safety filters, and then it's detokenized, so we can actually decipher like, okay, this is human language. All right, quite a bit there, I know. Risk and limitations. So I'm going to keep this short. The biggest one that we care about as faculty is this thing called hallucinations. And this typically arises due to the models like predict the next token architecture. It's really built into like how they work. I mean, this is part of their magic. This is why they're so powerful, but also why they're fairly limited in some ways. Probability, sometimes not the best, and certainly often not the most accurate answer, right? And so, we saw this occur quite a bit in 2023. A common thing, like you'd say like, hey, you'd be asking about a certain author and you'd ask us something like, hey, did this author ever publish about this topic? If so, where? And they would list off like, oh, this article or this book. And often those books or articles would not exist, right? Or like, who's written about this topic? It would make up authors that did not exist, right? These are called hallucinations. It's like, things that sound likely that should be true or likely to be true, but they don't actually exist, right? Um, so this is the main concern. And so just an actionable tip, because this presentation is about being actionable, and this is something I do not hear in these kinds of presentations. I don't know why it's not addressed. There are things you can do about this. One is it's gotten a lot better since 2022, 23. Also, like larger context windows result in fewer hallucinations. So what does that mean? Free ChatGPT, if you don't pay for an account, has 8,000 tokens per conversation, right? That's the context window. That's the amount of information it can take into account when it runs through the base model, right? Or when it runs your prompt through the model. And that's about 6 to 8 pages, not very much. If you pay for ChatGPT, so $20 a month, that's 32,000 tokens per conversation, which is about 80 pages. With these thinking models, it's really fascinating. I don't know if they're going to like change this at some point because it seems like they're allowing for like quite a bit of difference. But even with Plus ChatGPT, the Plus tier, with thinking, it's 192,000 tokens per conversation. It's about 300 pages, like the size of a book, right? And so that means if you are aware of your like context window, like are you paying for ChatGPT? Are you toggling the thinking mode? You're going to increase the likelihood that you'll get a lot of hallucinations or decrease that likelihood. All right, is anything in the chat I should address? Yeah. All right, I'm gonna move faster here so we can move on to the meats. Bias you should be aware of. We have data on what kind of political bias they have. They tend to lean left, libertarian. You can see the source there for how they figured that out. That's as of April 2025. Also, we can think in terms of like cultural bias, Western versus Eastern flavors, global North versus global South, and they tend to have a Western bias. And so, if you compare DeepSeek's, models with like Western models, DeepSeek is a Chinese model. You're going to get a slightly different flavor, slightly different interaction, which is interesting. And then finally, like I think this is not a slide I would have included like 6 months or even a year ago, but like increasingly, I think it's important to point out like these machines are built to be engaging and to display confidence even when they shouldn't, right? So they're engineered for stickiness, like social media. You might feel like you have a chatbot buddy over time, but they're not. I mean, this is how they're engineered to be, right? They prioritize engagement over accuracy. And just like we tell our students this, but the outputs will sound really super convincing sometimes, and they're often seriously flawed. Other ethical concerns, we don't have time to cover this. This is not a presentation on like the ethics of using generative AI. But here are links. This is from the University of Colorado Boulder Learning Design Group, or they like this slide that they had in their presentation. So that's there for you if you want to explore further. But we're going to move on. All right, Kevin is going to give us kind of the core foundation for prompting now.
There we go. Let's see. Are you guys able to see my screen? Oops, actually, helps if I click share. There we go. Now you should see everything. Okay. Changed everything. Switched over to sharing. Okay. Um, to where we were. Okay. So prompting basics. So talk a little bit about here about different strategies. So the prompting attempt, this whole idea behind Swift strategy, it's technically called zero shot. You just put a prompt in, create a, like in this example, create a 10-question quiz about chance ethics. What's weak about the prompt? It's, it's not specific. It doesn't show like, what are we trying to test for? Maybe what level, things like that. And this can be, in teaching about AI very early on, a lot of people would use AI basically as the new Google prompt. They would do these really short statements, questions, maybe even keywords. Those don't work. These are conversation engines. So we then developed some different frameworks, different ways to think about when we work on these. And we call that prompt engineering. It's the designing, finding inputs and prompts given to these LLMs. We've discovered that when we give them context, we're going to reduce hallucinations. When we give them limitations, we're going to reduce hallucinations. And there's a whole bunch of different frameworks. You've got like this RTF role task format. That is really the most basic, I think, out there. Define what it should act as, give it a clear task, something to do. And really the task is one of the most important parts. And then give a format, like what do you want it to respond with? All these different ones, they're very, very similar when you really look at them. Here, so here's the basic elements. So again, those were kind of your basic ones. You'll see those all over, really. But with prompt elements, you usually have some sort of task. What do you want it to do? You're going to have some sort of context. And this is a new concept out there that you're starting to see more and more. So context engineering instead of just prompt engineering. And this is where you explain the situation. You can upload documents. You can just provide context for what you're looking for. Be specific, give it, direct the LLM where you want it to go. ChatGPT 4.0 was pretty good without a lot of context. ChatGPT 5 really needs you to prompt with intention. Tell it what you want it to do and explain why you want to do it. Much like when you're trying to talk with younger kids, it's very similar talking with younger kids and talking to an LLM. This here also shows, your instructions, your actions. Then you've got some optional add-ons. You can give it a role, specify what role. This could be, an instructor. This could be a marketer. This could be Batman. That can help define what it sounds like, what it looks like. Sometimes I will have it, sorry. Sometimes I'll ask it to look at different people and kind of give it a voice if I wanted to write in a specific style of voice. Providing examples. This goes back to that idea of the zero-shot prompt. There's what are called one-shot prompts or multi-shot prompts. That's where you give it multiple examples or a single example. LLMs are very good at following examples. So if you can provide it examples, you're going to get a lot better quality out of it. You're going to make it really helps it look like what the example is. And then once you get all that done, ask it questions. Ask it, or even, and like this time, ask the chatbot to ask you questions. It needs to complete the task. This is an area that I sometimes use, and a lot of times I probably should use it more. You could create your prompt and then at the end of it, put something like, ask me any questions so that you can produce a better result, something along those lines. And then after you get your results, you can ask it questions, critique it, have a conversation. Um, a lot of times people just will take, and I see this with students all the time, they will take the first response. And a lot of times you can say, hey, I don't like this part, or I don't think this part's quite correct. Let's think about this deeper. You can give it a conversation and a direction to go and get a higher quality response. That's one of the things that I tend to do a lot. I'd really like to use. So again, this is a lot of your basics here. From here, there are things called mega prompts that have a lot more information than just these few things. And then we can get into prompt refinement. So all of the platforms nowadays are starting to say we should be using some sort of data formatting, be it Markdown or XML. JSON also works. The issue with JSON is that it will put the LLM into a programming mind space, and a lot of times you don't want that. So be careful doing that, but Markdown and XML work really, really well. I've got here, this is a cheat sheet. I'll put a link here in the chat. You don't really need to know a lot about Markdown. It's just kind of the basic stuff up here. The Markdown the very basics of the Markdown is really all that you need. And like I said, check the chat for it. The top bunch is really all you need, like headers, bold, italics, really basic stuff. Like what this is looking at here, this Canvas quiz creator, that is an H1 or header 1 title. Just like you would use in Word, but instead of using a drop down and choosing a header, you're putting a pound sign to show it's a header. The star for task, that means that it's bolded. A dash with a space, that means that it's an unsorted list. If you put a number, it's going to be a sorted list with numbers. I don't see an asterisk here. If you use a single asterisk, that just means italics. So you can create this data, you can explain your data a lot better when you're using this. Oh, another really good one to use is 3 dashes is a line. So you can put information under that. It works really well when you are creating a prompt and you can section pieces off of it. This is a little more advanced, I will admit, but it's not that much more advanced and it doesn't take long to pick it up. Again, I can look down here on this example and I can read this as English, and then I just have to understand what do the extra, asterisks and things mean. It's still pretty straightforward. I use a cheat sheet still because honestly, oh, sorry. I use a cheat sheet still because a lot of times, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I will forget what the individual pieces are, and by using a cheat sheet, I can fix that. Let's see here. Also, prompt optimizers. There's OpenAI's got a GPT prompt optimizer. Anthropic has one. Gemini has one. They've all produced documents as well that go along those lines that will have different. They're basically prompting guides that teach you how to prompt for those specific LLMs. But honestly, once you do one, you've kind of learned them all. They all are very, very simple. The biggest issue you're going to run into is if you're looking at an older technology, say you're doing a project that has a self-hosted, small model, they're going to require more structure. They're going to require some different prompting techniques than, say, a large model that can understand what you want better. Evaluating output. So you want to make sure that there is, your accuracy. You always want to check, you want to be the human in the loop, or a newer term I'm hearing is the expert in the loop, because a lot of times what sets us apart is that we are the experts. So you want to go through and check it for accuracy. As Heidi said, there was a book list that the books listed were not actually real books. Facts need verifications. Information that seems detailed but lacks sources. Check the sources. Always verify quotes. A lot of these LLMs actually allow you to go through and check the sources now. You can click on them. Notebook LM is incredible for just making that very easy to find. You have bias, one-sided perspective, missing context. Check for these things. Worldview bias, responses that fit your biases or instructions too tightly, overfitting. Overfitting is an issue too. This is one of the areas where just practice is going to make you better, because overfitting is almost a field. You want to create enough context, enough limitations to focus the LLM to produce good results, but you don't want to you don't want to limit it so much that you overfit it. And that's just a feel. That is just practicing using LLMs and just developing that feel as you go along. And that's really the only way to learn that one. Relevance, generic responses that don't match context, examples that don't fit. Just make sure relevance is there as well. This is one area that I will admit I see fewer problems usually with an LLM than I do in other areas. I would say bias and accuracy are areas where I see a lot more issues. Conversation steering refers to techniques and strategies used to control to guide the direction and flow of the conversation. Again, these AI systems are trained on our speaking. They're trained on our interactions online. For the good and the bad, they're trained on Reddit, they're trained on Tumblr, they're trained on everything out there in these conversations. So they're very good at working through a conversation and having a two-way dialogue, basically. So this is an example. So you can say, hey, here's something simple. And I should actually, let me take a step back here. I should point out too, don't ever hold off trying to use an AI because you're not sure how to prompt it properly. Just start with a question. Can you explain how diabetes affects the kidneys? We don't have a full framework there. We're just asking it a question. Then you can do follow up and respond to it and get it to go the direction that you want, that the conversation brings in the rest of what you would have in that initial prompt. I will give a couple of caveats. It's ChatGPT 5, the new version of ChatGPT, does not respond quite as well to conversation steering as previous models. What will happen at times is that when you do your initial prompt, the model will get in kind of their headspace or their latent space, what they think the answer is. And sometimes it can be difficult to steer them away from that preconceived notion. Kind of like arguing with somebody that's got very stringent opinions they don't want to change. When that happens, I recommend either doing a prompt saying, forget everything you have heard before, or just open a new prompt and start over. What really sucks is if that happens and you're really deep into a conversation. But in my experience, once it locks into an idea, it can be very, very difficult to get it to release that idea. So that is something to keep in mind when you're dealing with these. And then I'm going to turn this over to Heidi for the AI in higher ed workflows.
All right, let's see if my sharing, I usually use PowerPoint. So I have been told that if I use the sharing mode in Google Slides, it works beautifully. So we're going to try it. All right. Okay, is that showing the presenter mode or is that showing the viewer mode?
That is presenter mode.
It's showing presenter mode. Okay, well then I am going to reset and just go to the standard mode. So go back here to this, and we'll just go with the basic. Okay. Again. Okay, So as Joel and Kevin have talked about, this whole goal is to have a very clear how does this actually help us in higher education? And so one of the biggest use cases is finding very effective workflows. And the best tasks that work for that are things that can be easily replicated so that you don't have to go through that J curve every single time you engage in a task. So some of the things, oh, actually, if I'm sharing screen too, then I need to leave this on screen too. So some of the things that work really well are the types of things that once you do them, you can do them again, and you can sometimes save the final prompt. So once you finish a task and you have a successful output, it's very, very helpful to go through and say, can you give me a prompt that will help me achieve this output more quickly next time? And then you can save that prompt into just your regular notepad and go back in, and next time you have to go through that same task, that same course design or iterating a rubric, you can start with that prompt. And then every level of going through that J curve makes it more and more shallow until you're just getting directly the output that you want the next time you go through. So that can be an extremely effective way of making this more user-friendly and making the iterations faster and more effective every single time. So the first thing that I think a lot of us faculty do is content creation and then content transformation or adaptation when you are dealing with a custom situation. I think we've all had those teaching situations where we have to make a little tweak because there's something about this class or this delivery or this particular situation that requires a little bit of adaptation. And so that's where it can be extremely helpful. So if you look at this prompt here, where it says you are an expert, and then you can insert your subject. This builds on what Kevin said. Instructor, create a lesson plan on, and then the name of the topic for the kind of course that you're teaching. And then you can include some learning objectives and add some specific learning activities. And the reason that this really helps is that it enables you to input your values framework. And I think that's where what Joel said about freeing us up to work at a higher level and do more enriched things, that's where this really comes in. Because if you are dealing, for instance, with a 3 p.m. class and the energy level is very low, that's not the same class that you give on the same subject and the same material at 10 a.m. in the morning when everyone is at peak energy. It just can't be the same class. And so having this allows you to tweak the framework here and say, we're gonna need more movement in this class. We need things that have people standing up. We need things that involve a little bit of personal reflection. We need maybe a story, maybe even some music. And so this prompt allows you to integrate those things and to have a very fast adaptation that is values driven and also content rich, because you are also bringing in the content. Similarly, you can also do something when you're generating activities and assignments. So here, this prompt is very similar to the last one. Devise an assignment for, and then you've got the course on the topic, and then you can put in your vision for what you want this assignment to be like for the student. Again, this is very values driven because it allows you to do something that is student facing. It takes into account the actual rhetorical and the population dynamics that you're dealing with. And so you can get very specific. We're looking for, I want this to take an hour. I want this to involve creative thinking or personal reflection or whatever it is that your target is. And then you can have some kind of, what is it that you are wanting them to bring out of this, to produce out of this? And this will help you have that kind of prompt, and then it will generate the deliverables, because that's the biggest thing I think that it sometimes impedes our ability to teach in a higher, more values-driven way, is that we are generating a lot of deliverables and we don't always have time to iterate those deliverables in a way that matches our creativity and the needs that we are observing in our class. But when we use AI, it helps us to it helps reduce just the friction on those deliverables, which frees us up for that higher order vision making, which is the reason we became educators in the first place. So these kinds of prompts can be extremely helpful with that. And then you can also add little tweaks where, maybe you have a unique situation where one of my classes, I have a student who has a very hard time staying on topic. And so my usual discussion prompts don't work as well because this student will kind of align the conversation in a way that does not flow with the way the conversation usually follows that pedagogical pattern. And so by doing this, I can adapt this prompt and I can say, here's the situation, design this kind of exercise, and it can help me, again, adapt what needs to happen to the unique situation, which I really like. Another one is rubrics. And one of the areas that I really, really love this is that I think we all know what we are evaluating, but generating those really transparent descriptions for students can be extremely time consuming. And I think a lot of us feel that there is a certain rightness in having clear, detailed, transparent rubrics, but again, it's that huge, deliverable generation. And so these LLMs can really help us streamline that and make those clear descriptive segments for each of the levels in each of the categories much more quickly. And I don't know about any of you, but Canvas's latest update actually updating the rubrics, at least in my UI, is very cumbersome. It's become much less user friendly. And so one of the things that I love is that AI can generate a CSV. So once you go through and you make a rubric that reflects what you're assessing and creates those very transparent and specific descriptions for the students, you can then generate that as a CSV, which you can load directly into Canvas. And that is a huge lift. I think one of the biggest adds that AI has for educators is that it reduces the software integration friction because it allows us to do things like directly generate HTML, directly generate Python code, and that speaks very clearly to well, in this case, Canvas, in a way that is harder to do when you're trying to edit and change the point value and copy and paste the descriptions and stuff. So I find that also extremely helpful. Another thing is that it can help adapt the tone. So part of meeting students where they are, and also part of student management, is making sure that our tone is appropriate to the situation. And sometimes this is easier than other times. So I think probably all of us have received that email that really activated our autonomic nervous system for whatever reason. And the standard way of regulating around that is to revise and edit, step away, take a drink, go for a walk, whatever. But an LLM can help to either check or mitigate your tone. So you're responding to a student who maybe addressed you in a way that was not academically appropriate. And you need to provide both instruction. So you need to address the content, but you also need to provide the model for how we speak academically. And so you can ask the LLM either, does this, what is the tone of my reply? Or you can say, all right, I think this tone might be a little more salty than I want to reflect. Can you help me soften the engagement that we're having here? So that's another thing that can be quite useful as well. Another really good potential here is chatbot tutors. And depending on what LLMs your institution allows you to use or your institution is sponsoring, I think all the LLMs have something that does this. So for Copilot, you've got agents. If your school uses Gemini or allows you to direct the students toward Gemini, you've got gems. For ChatGPT, of course, you've got custom bots that you can design. But what these can do is you can give them either a bot or a prompt, go back here, either a bot or a prompt that, in the words of the famous Captain Winchester from MASH, does one thing and does it very well. And so it tutors them through whatever it is that you're trying to teach. And you can be very specific. If you don't have the access or the subscription to design individual bots, you can also do this with a prompt. So you can take this highly engineered prompt that Kevin spoke about in the last section, and you can, for instance, give them something like this. Act as a encouraging or rigorous or even playful if you want to lighten the mood a little bit, and then the subject tutor. And then you are going to give it very detailed descriptions about how you want it to engage with the students. One thing that I would add is that you want to make sure you stress test these because these sometimes flatten or they deflate after 10 or 11 questions. So if you design something along this line, make sure that you stress test it from the perspective of, I suggest the most antagonistic student that you can imagine, or the most confused student that you can imagine. And that will give you a pretty good parameter of how they're going to behave. So, plus it's kind of fun to make your own chatbot and then argue with it. The final thing that I find very helpful is that chatbots can help a lot with policies. And as faculty, when I first was introduced to the concept of chatbots for policies, I thought, well, I mean, I know my own policies. I don't really need to have a chatbot check my policies for me. But where this really becomes helpful is either for staff who are managing a lot of different policies and they need to make sure that they are referencing the correct policy and keeping it aligned, or when we as faculty need to act within a policy that we ourselves did not write and therefore are not super familiar with. So classic example would be, I'm the creative writing club advisor. The club policies were just updated to a 34-page PDF, and it's very clear and transparent. But if I don't want to read the entire 34-page PDF, then I can give it to the chatbot and say, hey, my club would like to go to this particular writing training. What are the policies around how that could be funded? And so that can be extremely helpful as well. And then I'm going to turn this over to Kevin. He's going to talk about coding and technical, but the one thing that has really been surprising to me is how fluid AI can be at designing just very rudimentary code. Stuff as basic as HTML. If I can get the AI to design an HTML code for a document that is accessible and always follows the same pattern and has these levels of bullet points, in many ways, that is much more convenient and effective than trying to iterate that in the actual paragraph text generator. So with that, I will turn it over to our fearless programmer, Kevin, and I'm excited to hear what he says.
Kevin, I think you're on mute.
Okay. So can you see here the quiz maker in Gemini? Okay. So this is an example of using a creative program. So if you look in the Padlet, I've got this shared, the Gemini Gem quiz maker. This is the Gemini Gem. And if I go back here, quick, oh, actually, I'm just here. I already created. So I did a prompt. I basically called this, or inside of this, I added a doc with the my exam one questionnaire, or exam one terms and definitions. And I asked it to, using that prompt, to create a quiz for me. Now, in the background, it wrote the code. This is all a program. Now, I'm not really a programmer, so I'm not that good at that. But once it's there, I can click start the challenge. I'm not going to actually look at what those are, but it will tell me what these are, and I can go through and answer the questions, and it will get me through all of these. And it's got 10 quiz questions. Now, again, this is what I'm seeing. Cool. And one of the cool things about this is running actual code in the background, and I don't need to host anything. I don't have to have an environment to host it or anything. It just creates it for me. So this is a way of doing it. Another one that I use a lot. If you guys get annoyed by those WebP images, I can just do something like this. And oops, actually, that's not work. Sorry. The one thing you have to do, I forgot. In here, turn on Canvas. Canvas has got to be turned on, and then it'll do it. And this will then go through, it'll figure out what's needed. and write the program for me. So these are ways, so there you can see what it's doing here. So these are ways that you can use this to write basically software as a service, something really simple. So Lisa Long's asking about when I teach this. Now, this is so that game is kind of a theoretical. I've not actually used it with students. I use a different variation, which is just a simple uh, flashcard generator that's all in text. This to me is the next generation. I want to get around to doing that. I just have not done that yet. So that would be one way to do it. And I could literally go in here. Now this is done. I could share this. If sharing was set up correctly, I could actually share this conversation. Unfortunately, with Boise State, there's some issues with sharing, so it won't work that way. If you have your very own version of these, you can share the conversation, and then you would have all of that already pre-built. So all of the information would be in there, all the instructions and everything. And the other thing too is that you can put instructions. Like I said, this is more proof of concept to show what you can do. If I was going to make it student facing, I would put instructions and stuff like that. And I can show you an example of that. I have this create a mind branches style visual. So basically a mind map. And when you run it, go back. I've had a conversation with this already. Maybe.
Kevin, we have 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. So basically came up with this. And at the end here, it actually tells this is where you put it. I put it in here. You copy paste it here. And this is the mind map. So that's shown programming. This is also showing using a custom GPT. I use custom GPTs or Google Gemini gems if I'm going to have the same prompt used repeatedly. So we're going to skip the next two, but that basically goes into creating projects, creating custom GPTs as well. So any questions, or I'm going to turn it on over to Joel here.
Thanks, Kevin. I just wanted to emphasize the fact that what Kevin is showing is basically he's showing how prompts are all these fancy apps and stuff. They're just prompts. That's all they are, right? So once you learn the basics, we don't have time to get into this, but basically these projects, these apps, all this stuff, they're just prompts, and then you just click on different parts of Gemini or ChatGPT to access these things, right? So Google's Gemini calls these gems. Microsoft calls them agents. ChatGPT calls them projects or GPTs, depending on what you want to do. And the basics that you learned about prompting apply to just doing these things, but they're iterable. They can be shared. That's kind of the major difference there. And so Liza asked about this. There are different ways to share. So you can just share the prompt if you're going to build something that's fancy and it kind of works in Gemini or ChatGPT, where students can kind of play the game if they preview the code. You just share the prompt and say hey, plug this in. You can create a GPT in ChatGPT. You can create an agent in Microsoft and share it depending on your permissions at your institution. You can do a Gemini gem or another platform in your institution, right? So you just kind of have to figure out okay, here's the software I have available to me. I have the techniques to build this. How do I share it out? That is a strategy. Just to kind of wrap things up here. So, this is included in the slides here, but these are resources for remaining connected. So we have, this first link here is to our Google group, the Idaho Higher Ed AI Alliance. And this is just for conversations around AI, hey, what's going on with Canvas? Or here's a new event. So you can kind of click on that if you want to be part of that Google group. We have drop-ins on a weekly basis, Mondays, 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This has been running for a while now, and it's recently combined with AI. Jonathan Lashley is often there. Liza Long is going to be facilitating that. I'll be there throughout the year as well. If you have a Substack you want to share out, again, this is about building a community of practice. Feel free to let me know, and I'll add this to the slide in our resources. But we have a few of us already on here that have Substacks. This is about what Idaho faculty are doing. And I'll end there. So you'll see a link sent out about webinar 2. This is going to focus on assessment, how to design for learning in the age of Gen AI. So we'll all things assignments and AI is kind of what we'll tackle next. It's great to see you. Thanks for your time, Kevin and Heidi. Thanks for your excellent presentations as well. I'll stick around for questions, comments. I know we're out of time, so we'll end our official presentation there.
Thanks, everybody.